The sight of my 4-year-old twins huddled together on our front porch, soaking wet and shivering in the rain, will haunt me for the rest of my life. That single moment changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I married. About trust. About what it means to protect the people you love most. Sometimes the worst betrayals come from the people we invite into our most sacred spaces, the ones we trust with our children's hearts. My name is David Chun, and this is the story of how I went from a grieving widower desperate to rebuild his family, to a father who discovered that some people see children not as blessings to protect, but as obstacles to remove. 3 years ago, I stood in my driveway staring at my abandoned twins, finally understanding that my new wife had never intended to be their mother at all. If this story hits you in the gut the way it still hits me, please hit that like button and subscribe, because I promise you, what happened next will restore your faith in a father's love and a family's ability to heal. But let me start from the beginning, back when I still believed that love could fix anything. I was 28 when my world first fell apart. My wife Emma died in a car accident when our twins, Jake and Sophie, were barely 18 months old. One day I had a complete family. The next I was a single father drowning in grief and baby formula. Emma had been the organized one, the planner, the one who remembered doctor appointments and knew exactly how to soothe Sophie when she had nightmares. For 2 years, I stumbled through parenthood alone. My mother helped when she could, but she lived 3 hours away and had her own health issues. I hired babysitters who quit without notice. I brought the twins to work when daycare fell through. I burned more dinners than I successfully cooked. Some nights, after finally getting Jake and Sophie to sleep, I would sit on their bedroom floor and wonder if I was completely failing them. The twins barely remembered their mother, which broke my heart in ways I couldn't explain. Sophie would sometimes point to pictures of Emma and say, "Pretty lady." But there was no recognition, no understanding that this pretty lady had sung her to sleep every night for the first 1.5 years of her life. Jake never mentioned her at all. I felt like I was raising Emma's children without any of Emma's wisdom, and the weight of that responsibility terrified me. I had convinced myself that what my family needed was completeness. A mother figure. Someone who could braid Sophie's hair and teach her things I didn't know how to teach. Someone who could throw a baseball with Jake and help him navigate the world in ways only a woman could. I had convinced myself that finding the twins a new mother would somehow honor Emma's memory, would give my children the full family she would have wanted them to have. That's how I met Rebecca at a coffee shop near my office on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. She was reading a book about child psychology, which seemed like a sign from the universe. When Sophie spilled her juice box all over the floor, and I scrambled to clean it up while juggling Jake on my hip, Rebecca handed me extra napkins and smiled at the chaos with genuine warmth. "You're doing great," she said simply, and those 3 words meant everything to a father who felt like he was failing daily. Rebecca was 26, worked as a dental hygienist, and claimed she had always wanted children but hadn't found the right person to start a family with. She listened patiently as I explained my situation, nodded sympathetically when I talked about Emma, and seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of becoming a stepmother. When I introduced her to Jake and Sophie, she brought them small gifts and got down on their level to play. Sophie actually laughed at Rebecca's silly voices, and Jake let her read him a bedtime story without protest. For 6 months, Rebecca seemed like the answer to prayers I hadn't even known I was praying. She remembered the twins' favorite snacks. She helped Sophie pick out clothes that matched. She taught Jake how to tie his shoes. When I proposed, Rebecca cried and said yes, then immediately started talking about how excited she was to officially become Jake and Sophie's mom. We had a small wedding ceremony in my backyard with just our immediate families and the twins as our witnesses. Sophie scattered flower petals that Rebecca had taught her to throw, and Jake carried our rings in a little pillow Rebecca had helped him pick out. In the photos from that day, we look like a perfect reconstructed family. Rebecca is smiling down at the twins with what appears to be genuine love, and I'm looking at all 3 of them like I've finally figured out how to put my life back together. The first few months of marriage felt like redemption. Rebecca moved into our house and seamlessly took over many of the domestic responsibilities that had been drowning me. She packed the twins' lunches, scheduled their pediatrician appointments, and even started a bedtime routine that got them both sleeping through the night consistently for the first time since Emma died. I felt like I could finally breathe again, like I was being the father Emma would have wanted me to be. But looking back now, I realize I was so desperate for help, so grateful for any relief from the overwhelming responsibility of single parenthood, that I missed the signs that were right in front of me. The signs were there from the beginning. I just chose to ignore them because I needed Rebecca to be the solution to all my problems. The first red flag came 3 weeks after our wedding. I came home from work early to find Rebecca on the phone in our bedroom with the door closed. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call and claimed it was just her sister. But her sister lived in Oregon, and Rebecca had told me multiple times that they rarely spoke. When I asked about it later, she got defensive and accused me of not trusting her. I apologized immediately, desperate to keep the peace in what felt like our perfect new family. The second sign was how she treated the twins when she thought I wasn't watching. I caught glimpses of impatience when Sophie took too long tying her shoes, or sharp words when Jake spilled something at dinner. But whenever I was fully present, Rebecca was back to being the loving stepmother who seemed genuinely invested in their well-being. I told myself that adjusting to motherhood was hard, that even Emma had moments of frustration with the kids. Rebecca's relationship with my mother should have been my biggest warning. Mom had driven down for our wedding and stayed for a long weekend to get to know Rebecca better. I found Mom in the kitchen on Sunday morning looking troubled, staring into her coffee cup like it held answers to questions she didn't want to ask. "David, honey," she said carefully, "how much do you really know about Rebecca's background?" I got defensive immediately. "She's wonderful with the kids, Mom. She's exactly what we needed." "I'm sure she is," Mom said, but something in her tone made me uneasy. It's just that when I asked her about her family, her stories didn't quite add up. First she said her parents were divorced, then later she mentioned her father dying when she was young. And when I asked about her previous jobs, she seemed to get confused about the timeline. I dismissed Mom's concerns as protective mother instincts. Rebecca had been nothing but loving toward Jake and Sophie. She remembered Sophie's allergy to strawberries and Jake's fear of the dark. She had already started talking about enrolling them in better schools and planning family vacations. What more proof did I need that she genuinely cared about our family? But Mom wasn't finished. "There's something else, David. Yesterday when you were outside with the kids, I asked Rebecca about Emma's things. The photos, her jewelry, the rocking chair where she used to nurse the twins. Rebecca said it was probably time to clean house and move on from the past. That conversation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Emma's rocking chair was in the twins' room, and Sophie still liked to sit in it when she was sad. Her jewelry was safely stored in my dresser, waiting for the day Sophie might want to wear her mother's wedding ring or necklace. The photos of Emma were throughout the house because I wanted Jake and Sophie to grow up knowing their mother's face, even if they couldn't remember her voice. When I brought up Mom's concerns with Rebecca that night, she seemed genuinely hurt. "David, I would never ask you to erase Emma's memory. I just think it might be healthier for the kids to focus on building new memories instead of staying stuck in the past. But if you want to keep everything exactly the same, of course I understand." Her response seemed so reasonable, so selfless, that I felt guilty for doubting her. Rebecca was trying to build a future with us, and here I was questioning her motives because of my mother's suspicions. I apologized for bringing it up and promised that I trusted her judgment completely. That trust became my biggest mistake. Over the next few months, Rebecca gradually took over more and more of the twins' care. She convinced me that consistency was important, that having one primary caregiver would help them adjust better to our new family structure. I was working longer hours at my job in construction management, trying to save money for the house renovations Rebecca wanted to do. She suggested that it made sense for her to handle most of the day-to-day parenting, while I focused on providing for our family. I was so grateful for her help that I didn't notice how she was slowly isolating the twins from everyone else in their lives. She convinced me that the babysitter I'd used for 2 years was unreliable and replaced her with someone cheaper who only lasted a few weeks before quitting. She suggested that my mother's visits were disruptive to the kids' routine and should be limited to major holidays. When the twins' preschool teacher called to discuss some behavioral concerns, Rebecca handled the call and assured me everything was fine. By winter, Rebecca had become the gatekeeper to my children's lives. She scheduled their activities, chose their clothes, decided what they ate and when they slept. I told myself this was what partnership looked like, what sharing parental responsibilities meant. Emma had handled most of these decisions too, and I had been grateful then just like I was grateful now. But Emma had included me in everything. She had asked my opinion about preschools and discussed the twins' developmental milestones with me every night after they went to bed. Rebecca made decisions and informed me of them later, always with a smile and a logical explanation for why her choice was best. The first real betrayal happened on a Thursday evening in February. I had promised Jake I would help him with a craft project for school, something about making a family tree. When I got home from work, Rebecca told me she had already completed it with him because he'd been worried about getting it done on time. I didn't want him to stress about it, she explained, showing me the poster board covered with photos of our new family unit. Look how proud he is of it. Jake was proud. He beamed as he showed me the family tree that featured photos of him, Sophie, Rebecca, and me, but notably excluded any pictures of Emma. When I asked about it, Rebecca said gently, "We thought it might be confusing for the other kids to have a deceased parent on a current family tree." The teacher agreed it was better to focus on the family Jake has now. I stared at that family tree and felt something break inside my chest. Emma wasn't just Jake's biological mother. She was the woman who had carried him for 9 months, who had stayed up all night when he had colic, who had taught him his first words. Erasing her from his family tree felt like erasing the first 2 years of his life, the foundation of who he was. But when I looked at Jake's excited face, I couldn't bring myself to ruin his pride in the project. I swallowed my objections and praised his work, then went to the bathroom and cried for the first time since Rebecca and I had gotten married. That night, I called my mother and told her about the family tree. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "David," she finally said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I've been doing some research." What she told me next made my blood run cold. Mom had hired a private investigator to look into Rebecca's background. The investigation revealed that Rebecca had been married before, to a man with 2 young children from his first marriage. That marriage had ended in an ugly divorce after less than a year, with the ex-husband claiming that Rebecca had been emotionally abusive to his children. "She has a pattern, David," Mom said quietly. "She targets single fathers with young children." The private investigator found evidence of at least 2 other relationships that followed the same script. I wanted to hang up the phone. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard any of it. Rebecca was sleeping peacefully beside me, and down the hall, Jake and Sophie were safe in their beds, probably dreaming about the fun day they'd had with their stepmother. How could the woman who read them bedtime stories and made them laugh be the same person my mother was describing? But deep down, I knew Mom was telling the truth. All those little inconsistencies in Rebecca's stories, the way she'd isolated us from other people, the gradual erasure of Emma's presence in our home, it all suddenly made horrible sense. I was still processing this revelation when Rebecca stirred beside me and asked who I was talking to. I lied and said it was a work call, but I could feel her watching me in the darkness, and I knew that our perfect reconstruction of family life was about to crumble. I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. The confrontation I'd been dreading came 2 weeks later, but not in the way I expected. I had been watching Rebecca more carefully since Mom's phone call, looking for signs of the pattern the private investigator had uncovered. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. Rebecca wasn't just emotionally distant with the twins when I wasn't around. She was actively cruel. I came home early from a job site one Tuesday afternoon and heard shouting from upstairs. When I quietly climbed the stairs, I found Rebecca screaming at Sophie, who was sobbing on her bedroom floor surrounded by scattered crayons. "I told you to stay in your room and be quiet," Rebecca was yelling. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to deal with you and your brother every single day? Your real mother is dead, and your father doesn't want to deal with your constant whining, so guess who gets stuck with you?" Sophie was 4 years old. She was crying because she'd knocked over her crayon box trying to reach a coloring book on her dresser. And the woman I'd married, the woman I'd trusted with my children's hearts, was telling my daughter that her father didn't want her. I stood in that doorway feeling like someone had reached into my chest and torn out my lungs. This was the woman who'd cried tears of joy when I proposed, who'd promised to love my children as her own, who'd convinced me that she was the missing piece our family needed. When Rebecca saw me, her expression shifted so quickly it was like watching someone put on a mask. The anger disappeared, replaced by concerned confusion. "Oh, David, thank goodness you're home," she said, immediately kneeling down to comfort Sophie. Sophie had a little accident with her crayons and got upset. I was just trying to help her clean up. Sophie looked at me with red, swollen eyes, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach drop. Fear. She was afraid to contradict Rebecca's version of events. My 4-year-old daughter had learned to be afraid of the woman who was supposed to protect her. That night, after Rebecca went to bed, I sat with both twins in their room and tried to get them to tell me the truth about what had been happening when I wasn't home. What they revealed broke my heart into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. Rebecca had been telling them that I didn't really want them, that I only kept them around because I felt guilty about their mother dying. She said that if they were too much trouble, I might send them away to live with strangers. She told Sophie that she was too loud and annoying, and told Jake that he was clumsy and stupid. When they cried, she locked them in their rooms and told them that crying was for babies. "We tried to be good, Daddy," Sophie whispered, curled up against my side. "We tried really hard so you wouldn't send us away." I held my children and promised them that I would never, ever send them away, that they were the most important thing in my entire world. But the damage was already done. Rebecca had spent months systematically destroying their sense of security, convincing them that their place in their own home was conditional on their perfect behavior. I knew I had to get Rebecca out of our lives immediately. But when I went to see a lawyer the next day, I discovered that she had anticipated this moment and prepared for it carefully. 3 months earlier, Rebecca had convinced me to put her name on our house deed and our joint bank accounts for legal protection, in case something happened to me. She'd also had me sign papers making her the twins' legal guardian in the event of my death or incapacity. At the time, it had seemed like responsible family planning. Now I realized it was a trap. The lawyer explained that removing Rebecca from the house deed would require her consent or a lengthy court battle. Worse, as the twins' legal guardian, she had rights to them that couldn't be easily dissolved. If I tried to divorce her or remove her from their lives, she could claim that I was an unfit father and potentially gain custody of Jake and Sophie. "She's been planning this from the beginning," the lawyer said grimly. "These documents give her significant leverage over your children and your assets. If she chooses to fight you, this could get very ugly very quickly." I felt trapped in a nightmare of my own making. In my desperation to give my children a mother, I had handed a predator complete access to their lives and legal power over their future. Every signature Rebecca had asked for, every document she'd convinced me was just a formality, had been another bar in the cage she was building around my family. That night, I made the mistake of confronting Rebecca directly. I told her I knew about her pattern with other single fathers, about the divorce and the accusations of emotional abuse. I demanded that she sign papers removing herself from our house and give up her guardianship rights to the twins. Rebecca's response was calm and calculated in a way that terrified me more than screaming would have. "David," she said, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea like we were discussing weekend plans, "I think you're having some kind of breakdown. The stress of single parenting, your grief over Emma, the pressure of trying to make our marriage work, it's clearly affecting your judgment." She pulled out her phone and showed me a folder of photos and videos she'd been secretly collecting. Images of me looking exhausted and overwhelmed. A recording of me crying in the bathroom after a particularly hard day with the twins. Screenshots of my internet searches about depression and anxiety. "If you try to remove me from Jake and Sophie's lives," she continued, "I'll have to share my concerns about your mental health with Child Protective Services. I have documentation showing that you've been struggling to cope, that you've been emotionally unstable, that you may not be capable of providing a safe environment for young children." The trap was complete. Rebecca had spent months documenting every moment of vulnerability, every sign of the normal struggles that come with grief and single parenthood, and turned them into weapons she could use against me. If I tried to protect my children from her, she would use my love for them to destroy us all. "I don't want to hurt you or the children," Rebecca said, reaching across the table to pat my hand like she was comforting a confused child. "I just want us to be a happy family. But that means you need to trust me to do what's best for Jake and Sophie, even when you don't understand it." I stared at this woman I'd married, this stranger who'd been living in my house and sleeping in my bed while systematically torturing my children, and realized that I'd made a deal with the devil. I'd been so afraid of failing as a single father that I'd handed my children over to someone far more dangerous than my own inexperience could ever be. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would push me past my breaking point. "Oh, and David?" she said as she got up to rinse her teacup. "I should probably mention that I'm not actually planning to stay married to you much longer. I've already consulted with a divorce attorney about how to get the house and custody of the children. Apparently, with the right documentation about your mental instability, it's not as difficult as you might think." She smiled at me with genuine warmth, The same smile that had made me fall in love with her in that coffee shop almost 2 years ago. But don't worry. I'll take very good care of Jake and Sophie. They just need to learn to be less difficult. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Rebecca's peaceful breathing beside me, knowing that I was sharing a bed with someone who was planning to steal my children and destroy my life. I had no idea how to fight someone who had turned my love for my family into the weapon she would use to take them away from me. I also had no idea that Rebecca was already planning her exit strategy, and that it would involve abandoning my children in a way that would haunt me forever. The next 3 months were psychological warfare disguised as family life. Rebecca's control over our household became absolute. She convinced me to let her handle all communication with the twins' preschool, claiming that having multiple contacts was confusing for the staff. When Jake came home with a bruise on his arm, Rebecca explained that he'd fallen off the playground equipment and that the teacher had already been informed. When Sophie started having nightmares again, Rebecca said it was normal developmental regression and that I was overreacting by wanting to take her to a pediatrician. Every conversation became a minefield. If I questioned any of Rebecca's decisions about the children, she would sigh deeply and suggest that my judgment was clouded by grief and guilt. If I tried to spend one-on-one time with Jake and Sophie, she would find urgent tasks that required my immediate attention or create small emergencies that pulled me away from them. "David, I hate to interrupt your playtime," she'd say with perfect reasonableness, "but the insurance company is on the phone about the roof damage, and they say they can only talk to the homeowner today." The roof damage was always something. The insurance company, the bank, the contractor, the lawyer handling some urgent legal matter that Rebecca had discovered. Every crisis was real enough that I couldn't ignore it, but somehow they always emerged the moment I tried to connect with my children. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. Rebecca had rearranged the furniture, replaced Emma's family photos with pictures of our new family unit, and established routines that somehow never included me except as a provider and occasional disciplinarian. When the twins misbehaved, Rebecca would wait until I got home from work to inform me that they needed to be punished. "I hate having to tell you this," she'd say, "but Jake was extremely disrespectful today. I think he needs to lose television privileges for the week." I never got to hear Jake's side of the story. By the time Rebecca told me about these incidents, the twins had been sent to their rooms and Rebecca had already decided on the appropriate consequence. When I tried to talk to Jake or Sophie about what had happened, they would just stare at me with wide, frightened eyes and mumble that they were sorry. My mother's calls became less frequent after Rebecca started answering the phone and explaining that I was too busy or stressed to talk. When Mom did manage to reach me directly, our conversations were stilted and brief because Rebecca was always hovering nearby, listening to every word. "How are the children doing?" Mom would ask. "They're fine," I'd say, acutely aware of Rebecca's presence in the room. "Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. Jake had stopped laughing. Sophie had developed a stutter that appeared whenever Rebecca was around. Both children had become hypervigilant, watching Rebecca's face constantly for signs of displeasure and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The breaking point came when I discovered that Rebecca had been medicating the twins without my knowledge. I found the prescription bottles hidden in the back of our bathroom cabinet while looking for aspirin. Anxiety medication for Sophie, ADHD medication for Jake, both prescribed by a pediatrician I'd never heard of and filled at a pharmacy across town. When I confronted Rebecca about it, she had a perfectly reasonable explanation ready. "The children were having such a hard time adjusting," she said. "Sophie's anxiety was getting worse, and Jake couldn't focus at school. I took them to a specialist who confirmed that they needed medical intervention. I didn't want to worry you with more problems when you're already under so much stress." She showed me official-looking documents from the doctor visits, complete with clinical assessments describing the twins as emotionally disturbed children who were struggling to cope with their mother's death and their father's subsequent remarriage. According to these reports, both children were exhibiting signs of attachment disorders and oppositional behavior that required pharmaceutical management. "The doctor said it's very common in blended families," Rebecca explained. "The children are acting out because they're conflicted about accepting me as their new mother. The medication helps them process their emotions more appropriately." I stared at those medical reports describing my children as mentally ill troublemakers and felt like I was losing my mind. Jake and Sophie had been happy, healthy kids before Rebecca entered our lives. Yes, they'd struggled with Emma's death, but they'd been healing. They'd been laughing and playing and learning to trust the world again. Now they were being drugged into compliance by a woman who saw their grief and confusion as behavioral problems to be medicated away. "I want to speak to this doctor myself," I said. "Of course," Rebecca agreed. "I'll set up an appointment. But David, you need to understand that questioning the treatment plan could be seen as medical neglect. The doctor is required to report any parents who refuse to follow his recommendations." Another trap. Another threat wrapped in concerned reasonableness. If I tried to protect my children from unnecessary medication, Rebecca would claim I was neglecting their medical needs. If I went along with her plan, I was allowing my healthy children to be drugged because they weren't adapting quickly enough to their stepmother's expectations. That night, I made a decision that I thought would save my family. I told Rebecca I was planning a business trip that would take me out of town for a week. Instead, I took time off work and spent my days documenting everything I could find about Rebecca's treatment of the children. I installed hidden cameras in the house. I made copies of the medical records and contacted the prescribing doctor to verify their authenticity. I reached out to Rebecca's ex-husband to learn more about her previous marriage. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find to prove that Rebecca was psychologically abusing my children. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. The medical records were fake. The doctor Rebecca claimed had examined the twins had never seen them. She had created elaborate forgeries to justify medicating children who didn't need medication, using online templates and stolen letterhead to make the documents look official. Rebecca's ex-husband was eager to talk once he realized who I was. His story was almost identical to mine, a recent widower with young children who'd been swept off his feet by a woman who seemed too good to be true. The difference was that his children had been older and able to articulate what was happening to them. "She told my kids that I didn't really want them," he said during our phone conversation. "She convinced them that they were burdens, that they needed to earn their place in the family by being perfect. When my son started having panic attacks, she insisted he needed therapy and medication. When my daughter stopped eating, Rebecca said it was normal attention-seeking behavior." His voice cracked as he continued. "The worst part was how she turned me against my own children. Every time they tried to tell me what was happening, Rebecca had an explanation that made them sound like troubled kids who were lying for attention. I started to believe that my children were the problem instead of seeing that Rebecca was systematically destroying their sense of security. The hidden cameras revealed the truth about what happened in our house when I wasn't there. Rebecca ignored the twins for hours at a time, leaving them to fend for themselves while she talked on the phone or watched television. When they approached her for help or attention, she would snap at them or send them away. When they made normal childhood mistakes, spilling juice, dropping toys, asking too many questions, she would scream at them and threaten to tell me how bad they'd been. But the most devastating footage showed Rebecca coaching the twins on what to say to me when I got home from work. "Remember," she would tell them, "Daddy is very tired and stressed. If you bother him with complaints or problems, it will make him sick. Good children don't make their parents sick by whining about every little thing." She was teaching my children to protect me from their own suffering. They weren't being quiet and compliant because they were healing. They were being quiet and compliant because Rebecca had convinced them that expressing their pain would literally make their father ill. I had enough evidence to destroy Rebecca in any court proceeding. But when I tried to access our bank accounts to hire a lawyer, I discovered that she had cleaned them out. The woman who'd promised to love my children as her own had stolen our life savings and disappeared. At first, I thought she'd just run away. I came home from work expecting to find an empty house and a note explaining that she'd decided our marriage wasn't working. Instead, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. Rebecca was still there, but she was packing suitcases and talking on the phone about flight arrangements. When she saw me, she ended the call quickly and smiled with the same warmth she'd shown me in the coffee shop where we'd first met. "David, perfect timing," she said. "I have wonderful news. My sister in Phoenix is getting married next weekend, and she's asked me to be her maid of honor. I'm going to fly out tomorrow morning and stay for about a week to help with the wedding preparations." She was lying. I knew she was lying. Her sister lived in Oregon, not Phoenix, and Rebecca had told me months ago that they barely spoke. This was her exit strategy. She would leave for her fake family emergency and simply never come back. "What about Jake and Sophie?" I asked. "Well, they'll stay here with you, obviously," she said, looking at me like I'd asked a ridiculous question. "I thought it would be good for you to have some one-on-one time with them. You've been saying you want to be more involved in their daily care. I should have been relieved. Rebecca was removing herself from our lives voluntarily, which would save me the legal battle I'd been dreading. But something about her demeanor made me uneasy. She was too calm, too cheerful, too confident about leaving. When will you be back? I asked. Oh, I'm not sure exactly, she said vaguely. These family things, you know how they are. It could be a few days, it could be longer. But don't worry, I'll call and check on you and the children. That night, I lay awake listening to Rebecca's breathing and trying to figure out what she was really planning. She had access to our bank accounts, legal guardianship of my children, and documentation that could be used to claim I was mentally unstable. If she wanted to disappear with Jake and Sophie, she had all the tools she needed to do it legally. But she was leaving them with me. Why would someone who'd spent months positioning herself to gain custody of my children suddenly abandon them voluntarily? The answer came the next morning, and it was more devastating than anything I could have imagined. Rebecca left at 6 in the morning while the twins were still asleep. She kissed my forehead goodbye and whispered that she loved me, then wheeled her suitcase out to the taxi waiting in our driveway. I watched from the bedroom window as she loaded her bags, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely in my own home. I took the day off work to spend with Jake and Sophie. We made pancakes for breakfast, built a blanket fort in the living room, and played games without anyone watching the clock or criticizing how much noise we were making. For the first time since my marriage to Rebecca, my children laughed freely and loudly, the sound filling our house like music I'd forgot how much I missed. Sophie climbed into my lap while we watched cartoons and said, "Daddy, when is Rebecca coming back?" "In a few days, sweetheart," I told her, though I secretly hoped Rebecca would decide to stay away permanently. "Good," Sophie said quietly. "I like it better when it's just us." Jake nodded from his spot on the floor, not taking his eyes off the television but clearly listening to every word. These were the first honest emotions my children had expressed about Rebecca in months, and hearing them confirmed what I'd suspected. They were afraid of her too. That afternoon, I called in sick for the rest of the week. I wanted to use this time to help Jake and Sophie readjust to life without Rebecca's constant surveillance and criticism. We went to the park where they ran and played without worrying about getting their clothes dirty. We got ice cream for lunch because we could. We spent an hour at the library where Sophie picked out picture books without anyone telling her they were too advanced or too silly for her age. For 3 days, we were a family again. The real family we'd been before Rebecca arrived. Jake's personality started emerging from the shell he'd retreated into. Sophie stopped stuttering. They both slept through the night without nightmares for the first time in months. On Thursday morning, I got a call that would change everything. "Mr. Chun, this is Principal Martinez from Sunshine Preschool. We're calling because Jake and Sophie haven't been picked up, and we can't reach their emergency contact." My blood went cold. "What do you mean they haven't been picked up? I'm at work. Rebecca was supposed to get them at 3. "Sir, it's almost 5 o'clock. We've been trying to call Rebecca for 2 hours, but her phone goes straight to voicemail. The children are very upset." I looked at my watch. It was 4:47 p.m. I was supposed to be at a job site 40 minutes away, but I'd actually been at home all day, waiting for Rebecca to call and check on us like she'd promised. She hadn't called once. "I'm coming right now," I said, grabbing my keys. "Tell the kids Daddy is on his way." During the 20-minute drive to their preschool, my mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe Rebecca's flight had been delayed. Maybe there was a family emergency and she'd forgotten to call the school. Maybe she'd lost her phone. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I found Jake and Sophie sitting in the preschool office with their backpacks, holding hands and trying not to cry. When they saw me, they ran into my arms like I'd been gone for weeks instead of hours. "Where's Rebecca?" Jake asked. "She was supposed to pick us up." "I don't know, buddy," I said, carrying both of them to the car. "But it's okay. Daddy's here now." That night, I tried calling Rebecca dozens of times. Every call went straight to voicemail. I called the hotel she'd claimed to be staying at in Phoenix. They had no reservation under her name. I called the airline she'd said she was flying on. They had no record of her purchasing a ticket. Rebecca had vanished completely, leaving my children stranded at school like abandoned packages. But that was just the beginning of her plan. Friday morning brought a knock at our door that made my stomach drop. A woman in a business suit with a clipboard and a stern expression introduced herself as Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services. "Mr. Chun, we received a report of child neglect. she said, stepping into my house without waiting for permission. Specifically, that your children were left unsupervised at their preschool yesterday and that their primary caregiver has abandoned them. Their primary caregiver is me, I said, following her into my living room where Jake and Sophie were eating breakfast. My wife had a family emergency out of state. She was supposed to pick them up from school, but something must have happened. According to our report, your wife Rebecca is the children's legal guardian and primary caregiver, Ms. Morrison said, consulting her clipboard. The report states that she had to leave town due to concerns about your mental health and ability to care for the children, and that you failed to make alternative arrangements for their care. I stared at her in disbelief. That's not what happened. Rebecca left for a wedding. I took time off work to be with the kids. The only reason they weren't picked up from school is because Rebecca disappeared. Mr. Chun, we also received documentation suggesting that you've been struggling with depression and anxiety, that you've been emotionally unstable, and that there are concerns about your fitness as a parent. She showed me a folder thick with papers. The photos Rebecca had taken of me looking exhausted. The recordings of me crying. Medical records claiming I'd been hospitalized for mental health issues. Records I'd never seen before because they were completely fabricated. Additionally, Ms. Morrison continued, we have reports that the children have been exhibiting signs of emotional distress and that you've been resistant to getting them appropriate medical care. More fake documents. More carefully crafted lies designed to make me look like an unstable father who was neglecting his children's needs. This is all false, I said desperately. My wife has been systematically abusing my children. I have evidence. I have recordings of what she's been doing to them. Mr. Chun, I understand you're upset, but making false accusations against your wife won't help your case. Our immediate concern is the safety and well-being of Jake and Sophie. She knelt down to talk to my children, asking them gentle questions about how they were feeling and whether they felt safe at home. Jake and Sophie, who had been trained by Rebecca to be suspicious of adults asking questions, gave cautious, minimal answers that could be interpreted as concerning. The children seem anxious and withdrawn, Ms. Morrison noted. This is consistent with the reports we've received about emotional neglect. I wanted to scream that my children were anxious because they'd been psychologically tortured for months, not because I was neglecting them. But every word I said seemed to make things worse, seemed to confirm the narrative Rebecca had carefully constructed about my mental instability. At this time, we're going to implement a safety plan, Ms. Morrison announced. The children will remain in your care, but they'll be monitored closely. You'll need to attend parenting classes and undergo a psychological evaluation. If your wife doesn't return within 72 hours, we'll need to discuss more permanent arrangements. After she left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the pile of paperwork that could potentially take my children away from me. Rebecca's plan was diabolically perfect. She had abandoned Jake and Sophie in a way that made me look negligent, then disappeared so she couldn't be questioned about her version of events. All the evidence pointed to an unstable father whose wife had fled due to his mental health issues, leaving him unable to properly care for his children. But Rebecca's masterpiece was yet to come. Saturday evening, as I was making dinner while Jake and Sophie played in the living room, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Rebecca's name, and I answered immediately. "Where the hell are you?" I demanded. Child services came to my house. The kids were stranded at school. What kind of person abandons children like that? Rebecca's voice was calm and sympathetic, like she was talking to a confused patient. "David, I'm so sorry you're upset. I know this must be very difficult for you." "Difficult for me? You left my children at school until almost 5 o'clock. They were terrified. Sweetheart, I didn't leave the children anywhere. You were supposed to pick them up. We talked about this before I left. You said you wanted to handle their care while I was gone." I felt like I was losing my mind. "That's not what happened. You said you would call and check on us. You said you would handle their normal routine." "David, I think you need to listen to yourself right now. You're becoming agitated and paranoid. This is exactly what I was worried about when I called CPS." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You called CPS?" "I had to," Rebecca said sadly. "After our conversation Monday night, when you threatened to hurt me if I didn't sign over the house, I became concerned about your mental state. When you started talking about hiding the children from me and making false accusations about my character, I realized you might be having a complete breakdown. I never threatened you. I never said anything about hiding the children. David, please calm down. Getting agitated like this is just proving my point. I called CPS because I love Jake and Sophie, and I'm worried about their safety. The caseworker told me about the incident at the school yesterday. Forgetting to pick up your own children, then trying to blame me for your mistake. That's not normal behavior. I was standing in my kitchen, holding the phone with shaking hands, while my children played innocently in the next room, completely unaware that their stepmother was systematically destroying their lives from hundreds of miles away. "Where are you, Rebecca?" "I'm getting the help I need to deal with this situation," she said. "I've been consulting with doctors and lawyers about the best way to protect the children. Everyone agrees that you need professional help before you can safely care for Jake and Sophie. I am safely caring for them. They're happy. They're healthy. You're the one who's been abusing them." "Oh, David," Rebecca said with genuine-sounding sorrow. "Listen to yourself. You're creating elaborate conspiracy theories about me abusing children who aren't even biologically mine. You're accusing me of abandoning them when you were the one who forgot to pick them up from school. This level of paranoia and blame shifting is exactly what the doctors warned me about." The trap was closing around me with perfect precision. Every word I said in my own defense could be twisted to support Rebecca's narrative about my mental instability. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered could be dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a man having a psychological breakdown. "I'm going to fight this," I said. "I'm going to prove what you really are." "I hope you get the help you need," Rebecca said gently. "For Jake and Sophie's sake. I'll be praying for all of you." She hung up, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the devastating realization that Rebecca had orchestrated my destruction with surgical precision. She had abandoned my children in a way that made me look negligent, disappeared so she couldn't be held accountable, and created a paper trail that painted me as an unstable father whose wife had fled in fear for the children's safety. But the worst part was yet to come. The real devastation that would strip away everything I thought I knew about protecting the people I loved most. The doorbell rang at 11:30 that night. When I opened it, I found 2 police officers and Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services standing on my porch. "Mr. Chun, we have a warrant to remove Jake and Sophie from your custody," Ms. Morrison said. "We received additional information tonight that indicates the children are in immediate danger." "What additional information?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. Rebecca had called in one final report. She'd told them that during our phone conversation, I had become violent and threatening, that I'd made statements about harming myself and the children rather than losing custody of them. She'd provided recordings of our conversation where my desperate denials and increasingly frantic tone could be interpreted as the ravings of an unhinged man. I watched helplessly as strangers woke up my children and carried them out of their home in their pajamas. Jake was crying and reaching for me. Sophie was asking why Daddy couldn't come with them. And I stood in my doorway, legally powerless to protect my own children from a system that had been turned against us by a woman who had planned this destruction from the very beginning. As the car carrying Jake and Sophie disappeared into the darkness, I finally understood the true scope of Rebecca's plan. She hadn't just been abusing my children. She'd been carefully documenting every moment of vulnerability, every sign of normal human struggle, and turning them into weapons that would ultimately separate us forever. I had lost everything. My children, my home, my reputation, my sense of reality itself. And somewhere out there, Rebecca was probably celebrating the success of her most elaborate con yet. But what I didn't know was that my nightmare was far from over. The next 6 weeks were a systematic destruction of everything I'd spent my entire adult life building. Jake and Sophie were placed in emergency foster care with a family I wasn't allowed to contact. I could see them for 1 hour every Wednesday afternoon in a sterile conference room at the CPS office, with a social worker monitoring every word we spoke. My children would cling to me during those visits, begging to come home, asking why they couldn't live with Daddy anymore. "The nice lady said you're sick," Sophie told me during our 3rd visit, her 4-year-old voice trying to make sense of something no child should have to understand. "She said sick daddies can't take care of little kids until they get better." I wanted to tell her that I wasn't sick, that the nice lady was lying, that this was all a terrible mistake. But I knew that everything I said was being recorded and analyzed for signs of the mental instability Rebecca had claimed I was exhibiting. So I just held my daughter and told her that Daddy loved her more than anything in the whole world. "When are you going to get better?" Jake asked. "When can we come home?" I didn't have an answer because I didn't understand what I was supposed to get better from. I wasn't mentally ill. I wasn't neglecting my children. I wasn't any of the things Rebecca's fabricated evidence claimed I was. But the system had decided that I was guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence seemed impossible when the proof of my guilt had been so carefully manufactured. My lawyer, the one I'd hired with our rapidly dwindling savings, explained the reality of my situation with brutal honesty. The recordings Rebecca provided make you sound unstable and potentially dangerous, he said during our first meeting. Her documentation of your behavior over the past year creates a compelling narrative about your deteriorating mental health. And the fact that she felt the need to leave town and contact CPS suggests genuine fear for the children's safety. But she's lying about all of it, I insisted. I have evidence that she was abusing Jake and Sophie. I have recordings of her screaming at them, fake medical records she created, testimonies from her ex-husband about her pattern of behavior. That evidence could help us eventually, he said. But right now it looks like the desperate accusations of a man trying to deflect blame from his own problems. Rebecca isn't here to defend herself against these charges, which makes them appear even more vindictive. He explained that family court moved slowly, that getting my children back could take months or even years of supervised visits, psychological evaluations, parenting classes, and legal proceedings. The costs would be enormous, and there was no guarantee of success. The best-case scenario is that you eventually regain custody with ongoing supervision, he said. The worst case is that the state terminates your parental rights and places the children for adoption. I walked out of that meeting feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My children could be given to strangers permanently. I could lose the right to be their father forever, all because I'd been naive enough to trust a woman who'd been planning my destruction from the moment we met. The financial devastation came next. Legal fees consumed our savings within the first month. I had to take out loans against the house to pay for the psychological evaluation the court required, the supervised visitation costs, and the ongoing legal representation I needed to have any hope of getting my children back. My job became impossible to maintain. I was missing work constantly for court appearances, CPS meetings, and the mandatory counseling sessions that were part of my family plan. When my coworkers found out why I was absent so frequently, the whispers started. Nobody wants to work alongside someone who's been accused of child neglect and mental instability. My supervisor called me into his office 6 weeks after Jake and Sophie were removed from my home. "David, I've tried to be understanding about your personal situation," he said, "but we can't continue to accommodate these absences. The project timelines are suffering, and the other workers are having to cover your responsibilities. I can work overtime to make up for it," I offered desperately. "I just need this job. I have to prove to the court that I can provide financial stability for my children." He looked genuinely sympathetic, but his answer was final. "I'm sorry, David. We're going to have to let you go." Losing my job meant losing my health insurance, my steady income, and my ability to pay the mounting legal bills. It also gave Rebecca's narrative more credibility. An unstable man who couldn't maintain employment was clearly not fit to raise children. I applied for dozens of jobs over the next month, but my references had been contaminated by the CPS investigation. Potential employers would start the interview process enthusiastically, then suddenly become cold and distant after running background checks that revealed the ongoing family court case. Nobody wanted to hire someone who might be a child abuser. The isolation was almost worse than the financial stress. Friends and neighbors who had known Jake, Sophie, and me for years started treating me like a dangerous stranger. The story of Rebecca's desperate plea to protect my children from my mental breakdown had spread through our community like a virus. My mother drove down from her home 3 hours away to help me navigate the legal system, but even she seemed uncertain about what to believe. "David, honey, I want to support you," she said during a particularly difficult conversation. But some of the things Rebecca told the authorities are very specific. The dates, the incidents, the medical concerns about the children. How could she have made all of that up? Because she's a professional con artist, Mom. Because she spent months documenting every moment I looked tired or overwhelmed and turned it into evidence of mental illness. But the children's teachers say Jake and Sophie seemed anxious and withdrawn before Rebecca left. If she was really abusing them, wouldn't they have been happier after she was gone? I couldn't explain that my children seemed anxious because they'd been systematically terrorized, not because I was neglecting them. I couldn't make anyone understand that Jake and Sophie's behavioral problems had been caused by Rebecca's emotional abuse, not by my supposed mental instability. The psychological evaluation required by the court was a nightmare of biased questions and predetermined conclusions. The psychologist, Dr. Margaret Henley, had clearly read Rebecca's reports before meeting with me and seemed to be looking for confirmation of the mental health issues Rebecca had documented. "Tell me about your relationship with your late wife," she said during our first session. "Emma and I had a wonderful marriage. Her death was devastating, but I worked through my grief with counseling and focused on being the best father I could be for Jake and Sophie. Rebecca's report suggests that you've never fully processed Emma's death, that you've been resistant to moving forward with your life." Rebecca wanted me to erase Emma's memory completely. She thought keeping photos of their mother was unhealthy for the children. Dr. Henley made notes that I couldn't see, but her expression suggested that my answer was somehow concerning. "How do you feel about Rebecca's decision to leave?" "She didn't leave. She abandoned my children and disappeared to avoid accountability for what she'd been doing to them." That's an interesting interpretation. Most people would describe a wife's departure during a family crisis as leaving, not abandoning. Your choice of language suggests some hostility toward Rebecca. Every answer I gave was twisted to support Rebecca's narrative. My grief over Emma became evidence of inability to move forward. My anger at Rebecca became proof of hostility and instability. My love for my children became obsessive attachment. My desire to protect them became paranoid delusions about a woman who had only tried to help our family. 3 months after losing my children, I lost the house. Without steady income, I couldn't make the mortgage payments or pay the mounting legal bills. The bank began foreclosure proceedings, and I had to accept that the home where Jake and Sophie had taken their first steps, where Emma and I had planned our future, where I'd foolishly believed Rebecca and I were building a new family, would soon belong to strangers. The worst part was packing up Jake and Sophie's rooms. Their toys, their clothes, their books, everything had to go into storage because I had no space for it and no idea when I'd be able to give it back to them. I sat on Sophie's bed holding the stuffed rabbit she'd slept with every night since she was a baby, and I cried harder than I had since Emma's funeral. The supervised visits became increasingly heartbreaking. Jake and Sophie would ask why they couldn't come to my new apartment, why they had to keep living with strangers, why their lives had been turned upside down. "I want to go home," Sophie said during one visit, climbing into my lap like she used to do every night before Rebecca destroyed our bedtime routine. "I know, sweetheart. Daddy is working very hard to bring you home. The foster mom says we might have to stay there forever," Jake said quietly. "She says our daddy might not be able to take care of us anymore." I looked at my 6-year-old son, who was trying to be brave while his world collapsed around him, and I felt like a complete failure. I had one job as their father, to protect them, and I had failed so spectacularly that they were now living with strangers who were preparing them for the possibility that I might never get them back. The final blow came during my 4th month of supervised visits. Janet Morrison from CPS pulled me aside after my hour with the children. "Mr. Chun, I need to inform you that we've received additional concerning information about your case." My stomach dropped. "What kind of information?" "Rebecca has been in contact with us from her location. She's provided more documentation about incidents of emotional instability and concerning behavior toward the children. She's also expressed willingness to return and seek custody of Jake and Sophie herself if the court determines you're unfit to care for them." I stared at her in disbelief. She abandoned them. She left them at school and disappeared. How can she possibly seek custody? Rebecca maintains that she left due to genuine fears about your mental state and the children's safety. She says she's been getting treatment for the trauma of living with someone who is becoming increasingly unstable, and that she's now ready to take on the responsibility of raising the children if necessary. The beautiful, diabolical perfection of Rebecca's plan hit me like a sledgehammer. She had engineered my destruction so completely that the very system designed to protect children was now considering giving my kids to the woman who had psychologically tortured them. Rebecca could return as the concerned stepmother who had tried to save the children from their unstable father. She had legal guardianship rights, a carefully constructed narrative about my mental illness, and documentation showing that she'd been the twins' primary caregiver before my breakdown forced her to flee. "The court date for the custody hearing has been moved up," Ms. Morrison continued. "Rebecca's attorney has filed a motion for emergency custody based on new evidence of your inability to provide appropriate care." I walked out of that CPS office and sat in my 15-year-old car in the parking lot, staring at the building where my children were probably wondering why Daddy looked so sad during their visit. Rebecca was going to win. She was going to get everything she'd planned from the beginning: my house, my children, and complete vindication for her actions. I had no money left for legal fees. I had no job prospects that would satisfy the court's requirements for financial stability. I had no way to prove my innocence when all the evidence supported my guilt. I had no hope of protecting Jake and Sophie from the woman who had already proven she was willing to destroy their lives to get what she wanted. That night, I sat in my empty apartment eating ramen noodles and staring at photos of my children on my phone. I thought about Emma and how she would have protected them from someone like Rebecca. I thought about the promises I'd made to be the father my kids deserved. I thought about how completely I had failed at the most important job I'd ever had. For the first time since this nightmare began, I understood why some people just give up. Why they stop fighting systems that seem designed to destroy them. Why they walk away from battles they can't win. I was broken, financially ruined, professionally destroyed, socially isolated, legally powerless. And the woman who had orchestrated my destruction was about to be rewarded with custody of the children she had spent months psychologically abusing. But sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, the universe has a way of showing you that rock bottom can actually be a foundation for building something stronger. I just didn't know it yet. The phone call that changed everything came at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, 6 days before Rebecca's emergency custody hearing. I'd been lying awake in my crappy apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to say goodbye to Jake and Sophie. The court had made it clear that unless I could provide evidence of financial stability, appropriate housing, and psychological fitness, they would likely grant custody to Rebecca. I had none of those things, and with the hearing less than a week away, there was no time to acquire them. When my phone rang, I assumed it was a wrong number or a scam call. Nobody had any reason to contact me at 2:30 a.m., and the few people who still spoke to me knew better than to wake me during the limited hours I managed to sleep. David Chun. The voice was female, older, with a slight southern accent. Yeah, this is David. My name is Patricia Williams. I'm calling about Rebecca Martinez. I sat up in bed so fast I got dizzy. Who is this? How did you get my number? I'm a private investigator, Mr. Chun. I've been tracking Rebecca for 18 months on behalf of 3 different clients. I understand she was married to you and had access to your children. My heart started racing. Had access? She's trying to get custody of them right now. That can't happen, Patricia said with an urgency that made my blood run cold. Mr. Chun, I need to meet with you immediately. Rebecca Martinez isn't who she claims to be, and your children are in more danger than you realize. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from Patricia Williams in an all-night diner, staring at a manila folder that she said contained information that would change my understanding of everything that had happened to my family. Patricia was in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had the demeanor of someone who had seen the worst of human nature and wasn't shocked by it anymore, but was still motivated to fight it. Rebecca Martinez isn't her real name, Patricia began, opening the folder. Her legal name is Rebecca and Kovac, and she's been operating this same con for at least 7 years that we can document. She showed me photographs of Rebecca with different men in different cities, wearing different engagement rings. In every photo, she was smiling and holding hands with a man who had young children visible in the background. She targets recently widowed or divorced fathers with children under the age of 10, Patricia continued. She presents herself as the perfect stepmother, gains legal access to the children and the father's assets, then systematically destroys the father's credibility while positioning herself to gain custody and control of his resources. I stared at the photos, recognizing the same warm smile Rebecca had given me in the coffee shop, the same loving expression she'd worn during our wedding ceremony. How many families has she done this to? I asked. We've identified at least 12 cases over 7 years. Your situation isn't unique, Mr. Chun. You're just the most recent victim. Patricia pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. Rebecca has successfully gained custody of children in 4 previous cases. 2 fathers lost parental rights completely. 1 committed suicide rather than continue fighting. The 4th disappeared. We think he may have taken his children and gone into hiding. The room seemed to spin around me. What happened to those children? That's where this gets really dark, Patricia said. Rebecca doesn't actually want to raise children. Once she gains custody, she places them in boarding schools or with relatives while she moves on to her next target. The children become tools for collecting child support and claiming government benefits, but she has minimal contact with them. I thought about Jake and Sophie, about their laughter and their bedtime stories, and their need for someone to help them navigate the world with love and patience. The idea of them being warehoused somewhere while Rebecca collected monthly payments for their care made me physically sick. One of my clients is Robert Henley, Patricia continued. His daughter is now 15. She's been in 3 different boarding schools in 5 years. Rebecca legally controls her trust fund, her inheritance from her deceased mother, and her relationship with her father. The girl hasn't seen Robert in 2 years because Rebecca convinced the court that contact with him was psychologically damaging. How is this legal? How is she getting away with this? She's very good at documentation and very good at understanding how family court systems work, Patricia explained. She creates extensive paper trails that support her version of events. She presents as the stable, concerned parental figure, while portraying the fathers as unstable and potentially dangerous. Most importantly, she disappears at crucial moments so she can't be questioned or held accountable for her claims. Patricia pulled out recordings and transcripts that made my blood run cold. Phone calls where Rebecca coached other women on how to document concerning behavior in their partners. Training sessions where she taught people how to create fake medical records and falsify psychological evaluations. Rebecca runs a network, Patricia said. She trains other women to run similar cons, and they share resources, strategies, and legal contacts. What happened to you wasn't personal. It was a carefully executed business plan. I sat in that diner booth feeling like I was learning about some elaborate criminal enterprise that existed in a parallel universe. If you have all this evidence, why isn't she in prison? Because family court isn't criminal court, Patricia said. The standards of evidence are different, and the system is designed to prioritize children's safety over investigating fraud. Rebecca is careful never to cross the line into criminal behavior. Everything she does falls into gray areas that are difficult to prosecute. She leaned forward, her expression intense. But Mr. Chin, your case might be different. Rebecca made mistakes with you that she didn't make with her previous targets. Patricia pulled out a recording device and pressed play. Rebecca's voice filled the small space between us, clear and unmistakable. The beauty of the Chin situation is that he documented everything himself. All those recordings he made thinking he was gathering evidence against me? They actually show a man becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. When I play them for the court, they'll hear someone having a mental breakdown, not someone discovering the truth. My heart stopped. Patricia had somehow recorded Rebecca talking about our case, about her strategy for destroying me. How did you get this? Rebecca has been staying with one of her associates while she waits for your custody hearing. We've had surveillance on the house for 3 weeks. She's been quite talkative about how easy it was to manipulate your situation. Patricia played more recordings. Rebecca laughing about how desperate I'd been for help with the children. Rebecca explaining her strategy for abandoning Jake and Sophie at school in a way that would make me look negligent. Rebecca coaching her legal team on how to present her as the concerned stepmother who'd been forced to flee an increasingly dangerous situation. There's more, Patricia said. We have documentation of the medical fraud, evidence of her previous cons, and testimony from other fathers she's destroyed. But Mr. Chin, time is running out. The custody hearing is in 6 days, and once Rebecca gains legal control of your children, getting them back becomes exponentially more difficult. I stared at this woman who had appeared in my life like some kind of guardian angel with evidence that could save my family. What do you need from me? I need you to fight, Patricia said simply. I need you to trust that this evidence can work, and I need you to be willing to go to war against someone who has more resources and legal connections than you do. She explained what fighting would mean. New legal representation that would cost money I didn't have. A media strategy that would make our case public and expose Rebecca's pattern of behavior. Coordination with law enforcement agencies in multiple states to build criminal charges that could stick. I won't lie to you, Patricia said. This will be brutal. Rebecca will escalate her attacks on your credibility. She'll try to destroy your reputation completely. She'll make you look like a vindictive ex-husband who's making false accusations because he can't accept that his wife left him. I thought about Jake and Sophie in foster care, asking when they could come home. I thought about Rebecca's plan to warehouse them in boarding schools while she moved on to her next victim. I thought about the other fathers who had lost their children to this same systematic destruction. What happens if we lose? I asked. Then Rebecca disappears with custody of your children, and you'll probably never see them again. She's very good at moving to jurisdictions where previous court orders are difficult to enforce. I sat there weighing my options. I could accept defeat, say goodbye to my children, and try to rebuild some kind of life from the ashes of what Rebecca had left behind. It would be easier, and there would be less pain in the short term. Or I could fight a battle I might not win, against an opponent who had more experience and fewer scruples than I did, with stakes that couldn't be higher. There's something else you need to know, Patricia said. We think Rebecca might be escalating. Her recent cons have become more sophisticated and more damaging. We have reason to believe she's planning something beyond just gaining custody of Jake and Sophie. She showed me financial records indicating that Rebecca had been researching life insurance policies, inheritance laws, and accidental death scenarios. Mr. Chun, we think Rebecca might be planning to eliminate you entirely once she has custody of the children. You represent an ongoing threat to her operation, and she's proven she's willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect her interests. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca wasn't just trying to steal my children and my assets. She might be planning to make sure I could never reclaim them or expose her operation. I looked at Patricia Williams, this stranger who had appeared in my darkest moment with evidence that could save my family and possibly my life. I thought about Emma and the promises I'd made to protect the children we'd created together. I thought about Jake and Sophie trusting me to bring them home safely. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. What do we do first? I asked. Patricia smiled for the first time since I'd met her. First, we get you a lawyer who specializes in fighting people like Rebecca. Then we start building a case that will not only get your children back, but put Rebecca Martinez behind bars where she belongs. She pulled out her phone and started making calls right there in the diner. Margaret? It's Patricia. I need you in court in 6 days for the case we discussed. Yes, it's happening. No, he's going to fight. As I listened to Patricia coordinating my legal defense, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, wishful thinking that had sustained me through the worst of this nightmare, but genuine hope based on evidence and strategy and the support of people who understood what I was fighting against. Rebecca had made a crucial mistake. She'd assumed that I would break completely under the pressure of her systematic destruction, that I would give up and disappear like some of her previous victims. She hadn't counted on someone like Patricia Williams documenting her crimes, and she hadn't anticipated that her own arrogance would provide the evidence needed to bring her down. The war for my children was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I believed I had a chance of winning. But first, I had to survive what Rebecca would do when she realized her perfect plan was falling apart. The custody hearing that would determine my children's future took place in a packed courtroom on a gray Thursday morning that felt like the most important day of my life. I walked into that courthouse looking nothing like the broken man Rebecca expected to face. Patricia Williams had connected me with Margaret Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, one of the most aggressive family law attorneys in the state. Margaret specialized in cases involving parental alienation and domestic abuse, and she had been preparing for this hearing like it was the Super Bowl. More importantly, I wasn't alone. Patricia had coordinated with law enforcement agencies in 4 states to build criminal cases against Rebecca's network. FBI agents specializing in interstate fraud were in the gallery. Reporters from 3 news outlets were present because Patricia had made this case public, exposing Rebecca's pattern of targeting grieving fathers. When Rebecca walked into the courtroom with her legal team, I saw her confidence falter for the first time since I'd known her. She had expected to face a defeated man representing himself with a public defender. Instead, she found herself looking at a coordinated legal assault backed by federal investigators and documented evidence of her criminal enterprise. She looked exactly as she had the day I met her, perfectly groomed, professionally dressed, with that warm smile that had convinced me she could save my family. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The calculating coldness behind her eyes, the predatory assessment of everyone in the room, the slight tension that suggested she was always ready to run. Judge Patricia Morrison, a different Morrison than the CPS worker, called the hearing to order. Rebecca's attorney began with the same narrative that had destroyed my life for 8 months. Your Honor, my client Rebecca Martinez is seeking emergency custody of Jake and Sophie Chin due to ongoing concerns about their father's mental stability and ability to provide appropriate care. Margaret Chin stood up with a confidence that made my heart race. Your Honor, before we proceed with Mrs. Martinez's petition, the court needs to be aware that Mrs. Martinez is currently under federal investigation for interstate fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment. The courtroom erupted. Rebecca's attorney jumped to his feet objecting, but Margaret continued. Furthermore, Your Honor, Mrs. Martinez is not who she claims to be. Her legal name is Rebecca Kovac, and she has perpetrated this exact same con against at least 12 families over 7 years. We have evidence that everything she has told this court about Mr. Chun is fabricated as part of an elaborate criminal scheme. Judge Morrison called for order and demanded to see this evidence immediately. Margaret activated a large screen at the front of the courtroom and began playing the recordings Patricia had obtained. Rebecca's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The beauty of the Chun situation is that he documented everything himself. All those recordings he made thinking he was gathering evidence against me? They actually show a man becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. I watched Rebecca's face as her own words condemned her. The warm, concerned stepmother mask slipped completely, replaced by something cold and calculating that made several people in the gallery audibly gasp. Margaret played more recordings. Rebecca laughing about how easy it was to manipulate bereaved fathers. Rebecca explaining her strategy for abandoning children at school to make their fathers look negligent. Rebecca coaching other women on how to falsify medical records and psychological evaluations. Your Honor, Margaret said, what we're hearing is not the voice of a concerned stepmother, but the voice of a professional con artist discussing her techniques for destroying families and stealing children. Rebecca's attorney tried to object that the recordings were inadmissible, but Judge Morrison overruled him. Given the serious nature of these allegations, I'm going to allow this evidence. Margaret then presented the financial fraud evidence. Bank records showing Rebecca had cleaned out accounts from previous targets. Documentation of fake medical credentials she'd used to justify medicating children who didn't need medication. Evidence of a network of accomplices who helped her research and target vulnerable families. Mrs. Kovac operates a sophisticated criminal enterprise, Margaret explained. She identifies recently widowed or divorced fathers through social media and community connections. She presents herself as the ideal stepmother, gains legal access to the children and assets, then systematically destroys the father's credibility while positioning herself to gain custody and control. The most devastating evidence came when Margaret called Robert Henley to testify via video link. Rebecca's previous victim spoke about losing custody of his daughter to Rebecca's manipulations, about the fake medical records and falsified psychological evaluations, about watching his child be placed in boarding school while Rebecca collected support payments and moved on to her next target. I haven't seen my daughter in 2 years, Robert said, his voice breaking. Rebecca convinced the court that contact with me was psychologically damaging. My 15-year-old thinks her father abandoned her because that's what Rebecca told her. I watched Rebecca during Robert's testimony. She was no longer bothering to maintain her concerned stepmother facade. Her attorney was frantically taking notes and whispering urgent instructions, but Rebecca just sat there with the expression of someone calculating her escape route. Margaret then called Dr. Sarah Kim, a child psychologist who had examined Jake and Sophie at Patricia's request. Dr. Kim's findings were damning. The children show clear signs of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse, Dr. Kim testified. They exhibit hypervigilance around authority figures, anxiety about expressing their needs, and trauma responses consistent with systematic intimidation. However, they show no signs of the developmental disorders or emotional disturbances described in Mrs. Kovac's fabricated medical records. The fake medical records were entered as evidence. Margaret showed the court how Rebecca had used stolen letterhead and forged signatures to create elaborate documentation of psychological problems that didn't exist. Mrs. Kovac was medicating healthy children based on falsified medical records, Margaret said. She was literally drugging Jake and Sophie to make them appear more compliant and emotionally disturbed. Judge Morrison's expression grew darker with each piece of evidence. When Margaret played recordings of Rebecca screaming at my 4-year-old daughter, telling her that her father didn't want her, several people in the gallery started crying. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret called me to testify. Mr. Chun, can you tell the court about your relationship with your children before Mrs. Kovac entered your lives? I spoke about Emma's death, about the challenges of single parenthood, about my genuine desire to find a mother figure for Jake and Sophie. I talked about how Rebecca had presented herself as the answer to our family's needs, and how gradually I'd realized she was systematically destroying my children's sense of security. The hardest part, I said, was watching my children learn to be afraid in their own home. Jake stopped laughing. Sophie developed a stutter. They both became hypervigilant, watching Rebecca's face constantly for signs of displeasure and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Margaret then asked about the night I'd discovered Rebecca medicating the children without my knowledge. I found prescription bottles hidden in our bathroom cabinet. Anxiety medication for Sophie, ADHD medication for Jake, both prescribed by a doctor I'd never heard of. When I tried to verify the prescriptions, I discovered the doctor didn't exist and the medical records were completely fabricated. The courtroom was completely silent as I described finding my children abandoned at preschool, the CPS investigation based on Rebecca's false reports, and the systematic destruction of my reputation and financial stability. Mrs. Kovac didn't just abuse my children, I said. She engineered a situation where the very system designed to protect them would take them away from me and give them to her. She turned my love for Jake and Sophie into the weapon she used to separate us. When Margaret finished presenting our case, Rebecca's attorney attempted a defense that fell apart immediately. He tried to claim that Rebecca had been genuinely concerned about my mental health, but the recordings of her laughing about my desperation made that impossible to argue. He attempted to suggest that Rebecca's previous marriages had been misunderstood, but Margaret had documentation from multiple jurisdictions showing the same pattern of behavior. Finally, he tried to argue that Rebecca truly cared about Jake and Sophie's well-being, but Dr. Kim's evaluation made it clear that my children had been psychologically tortured under Rebecca's care. Judge Morrison didn't even need to recess to consider her decision. Mrs. Kovac, she said, looking directly at Rebecca, in 30 years on this bench, I have never seen such a calculated and systematic campaign to destroy a family. The evidence presented today shows that you are not only unfit to have custody of these children, but that you represent an active danger to their psychological and emotional well-being. Rebecca finally spoke, and her voice carried none of the warmth and concern she'd used to manipulate everyone around her. Your Honor, these accusations are... Mrs. Kovac, Judge Morrison interrupted, you are not going to speak in my courtroom except to answer direct questions from counsel. The evidence against you is overwhelming and includes your own recorded admissions of criminal behavior. Judge Morrison granted me immediate emergency custody of Jake and Sophie. She voided all of Rebecca's guardianship rights and ordered that she have no contact with my children under any circumstances. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Morrison addressed the criminal aspects of the case. Mrs. Kovac, I am ordering that you remain in this jurisdiction while criminal charges are prepared. You will surrender your passport and submit to electronic monitoring. The evidence presented today suggests that you have committed fraud, identity theft, child endangerment, and conspiracy across multiple state lines. Federal marshals approached Rebecca's table with handcuffs. For the first time since I'd known her, Rebecca looked genuinely afraid. As they led her away, she turned back toward me with an expression of pure hatred. The mask had completely fallen away, revealing the predator who had been hiding behind the facade of the perfect stepmother. This isn't over, she said as the marshals guided her toward the door. Yes, it is, I replied, and for the first time in 8 months, I actually believed it. The courtroom erupted in applause as Rebecca was escorted out in handcuffs. Reporters crowded around Margaret and Patricia, asking questions about the criminal network and the other families who had been victimized. But I only had eyes for the back of the courtroom, where a CPS worker was waiting with Jake and Sophie. My children ran toward me like they hadn't seen me in years instead of days. Sophie crashed into my arms first, followed immediately by Jake, and we stood there in that courtroom holding each other while camera flashes went off around us. Daddy, Sophie said, her face buried in my shoulder. Are we going home now? Yes, sweetheart, I said, kissing the top of her head. We're going home. Judge Morrison approached us before we left the courtroom. Mr. Chun, I want to apologize on behalf of the system for what you and your children have endured. The evidence shows that you were the victim of an elaborate criminal conspiracy, and I'm deeply sorry that our processes were manipulated to separate you from your children. She handed me a document restoring my full parental rights and eliminating any ongoing supervision or requirements. Your children are lucky to have a father who fought so hard for them, she said. As we walked out of that courthouse together, I felt like I was emerging from the longest nightmare of my life. Jake held my left hand, Sophie held my right hand, and we stepped into the sunlight of a world where Rebecca could never hurt us again. But our healing was just beginning, and I had no idea how much stronger this experience would make our family. The first month after getting Jake and Sophie back was like watching flowers bloom after a long winter. We moved into a new house, not as big as the one Rebecca had helped me lose, but bright and cheerful with a yard where the kids could play safely. I'd used the settlement money from the civil lawsuit against Rebecca's network to make a fresh start in a community where nobody knew our story unless we chose to tell it. Jake's laughter returned first. 3 weeks after the custody hearing, I found him building elaborate Lego castles in his new bedroom, making explosion sounds and creating elaborate battle scenarios where the good guys always won. The hypervigilant little boy who had watched Rebecca's face for signs of displeasure was gone, replaced by the imaginative, energetic child he'd been before our nightmare began. Sophie's stutter disappeared completely once she realized that Rebecca was never coming back. Dr. Kim had been right about children's resilience. With consistent love and security, Jake and Sophie began healing faster than I'd dared to hope. They still had occasional nightmares, but they were sleeping through the night more often than not. The legal consequences for Rebecca exceeded my wildest expectations. Patricia Williams and her team had built such a comprehensive case that federal prosecutors were able to charge Rebecca under RICO statutes typically reserved for organized crime. She was facing 47 felony counts across 6 states, with the possibility of spending the rest of her life in federal prison. More importantly, 11 other families got their children back as a result of our case. The evidence we'd gathered helped expose Rebecca's entire network, leading to arrests in multiple states and the rescue of children who had been separated from their fathers through the same systematic fraud. Robert Henley was reunited with his 15-year-old daughter after 2 years of forced separation. When he called to thank me, I could hear him crying on the other end of the phone. She remembered me, he said. Rebecca had told her that I didn't want her anymore, but when she saw me, she remembered that I used to read her bedtime stories every night until she was 12. We're going to be okay. Those words meant everything to me. We're going to be okay. It became my mantra during the hardest moments of rebuilding our lives. My career took an unexpected turn after the story went national. Several construction companies reached out, offering me jobs and contracts once they learned about what my family had endured. But the opportunity that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Patricia Williams offered me a position with her investigative firm, specializing in cases involving parental alienation and family fraud. She said my experience gave me insights that could help other families avoid what we'd been through. You understand how these predators operate because you've lived through their tactics, she explained during our meeting. You can spot the red flags that other people miss because you've seen how sophisticated these cons can be. I accepted her offer, and within 6 months I was helping investigate similar cases across the country. The work was emotionally difficult, but incredibly rewarding. Every family we helped felt like a small victory against the people who had tried to destroy us. The most unexpected blessing came 8 months after the custody hearing, when I met Dr. Lisa Park at a support group for single parents who had been victims of family fraud. Lisa was a pediatrician whose ex-husband had used many of Rebecca's same tactics to gain custody of their son before disappearing across state lines. She had been fighting for 3 years to get her child back when our case broke, and the evidence against Rebecca's network helped her build a successful case for recovering her son. What started as shared trauma gradually became something beautiful. Lisa understood the hypervigilance that came from being systematically gaslighted. She recognized the triggers that could still send me into panic mode when Jake or Sophie were 5 minutes late coming home from school. She never pushed me to get over it or move on because she knew that healing from that kind of psychological warfare takes years, not months. Jake and Sophie adored Lisa from the moment they met her. She never tried to replace their memories of Emma or position herself as their new mother. Instead, she became their friend, their doctor when they were sick, and eventually, the woman who helped our family learn to trust again. When Lisa and I got engaged 18 months after Rebecca's conviction, Jake asked if he could help pick out the ring. I want to make sure it's the right one, he said seriously. Not like last time. My 6-year-old son's wisdom about recognizing genuine love versus manipulation amazed me. These children had been through hell, but they had emerged with an understanding of authenticity that most adults never develop. Our wedding was everything my marriage to Rebecca hadn't been: honest, joyful, and centered around the children who had brought us together. Sophie was our flower girl, Jake was our ring bearer, and Lisa's son Michael became the big brother Jake had always wanted. The blended family that Lisa and I created was built on a foundation of truth, transparency, and respect for each child's history and trauma. We went to family therapy together to make sure we were handling the integration properly. We talked openly about Emma and about Lisa's first husband, honoring the past while building something new. Most importantly, we never made promises we couldn't keep or created expectations that weren't realistic. The children knew that Lisa and I loved them, but they also knew that love was demonstrated through actions, not just words. 3 years after Rebecca's conviction, I received a letter that brought me closure I hadn't known I needed. It was from Rebecca, written from federal prison where she was serving a 30-year sentence. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or expressing remorse. Instead, she wanted me to know that she was writing a book about her experiences, claiming that she had been the victim of a justice system that didn't understand the complexities of blended family dynamics. I laughed when I read it. Even in prison, Rebecca was still trying to control the narrative, still positioning herself as the misunderstood victim rather than the predator she actually was. I threw the letter away without finishing it and went to pick up Jake and Sophie from school. Rebecca no longer had the power to disturb my peace or threaten my family's security. She had become exactly what she deserved to be, irrelevant to our lives. The children are now 9 and 10 years old. Jake plays Little League baseball and wants to be either a detective or a construction worker when he grows up. Sophie takes dance classes and has declared that she's going to be a doctor like Lisa, so she can help people feel better. They remember Rebecca, but not with fear. When they talk about that time in their lives, it's with the matter-of-fact resilience that children possess when they know they're truly safe. Remember when that mean lady lived with us? Sophie said during dinner last week. I'm glad you protected us from her, Daddy. I'm glad I did too, I replied, looking around our dinner table at the family we'd built from the ashes of Rebecca's destruction. Lisa was helping Michael with his math homework, while keeping one eye on the pasta sauce. Jake was telling us about his day at school with animated gestures that reminded me so much of Emma, it made my heart ache in the best possible way. Sophie was drawing pictures of our family that included everyone who mattered, me, Lisa, Jake, Michael, and even Emma, who she drew as an angel watching over all of us. This is what victory looks like. Not the dramatic courtroom triumph or the satisfying sight of Rebecca being led away in handcuffs, but this quiet evening around a dinner table with children who feel safe enough to be loud, messy, and completely themselves. I think about Emma often, especially during moments like these. I believe she would be proud of the father I became through this ordeal, proud of the family I've built with Lisa, and proud of the work I'm doing to help other families avoid what we endured. The trauma changed us, but it didn't break us. If anything, it made us stronger, more aware, and more grateful for the simple blessing of being together. To anyone watching this who has been through something similar, or who recognizes the warning signs I missed, I want you to know that there is hope on the other side of even the darkest betrayal. Your children's resilience will amaze you. Your own strength will surprise you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the experience that nearly destroys you will lead you to exactly where you were meant to be. If this story touched you, please hit that like button and subscribe because I share these experiences to help other families recognize the signs of predatory behavior before it's too late. The comments section is always full of people sharing their own stories of survival and recovery, and that community has become one of the most supportive places on the internet. Next week, I'll be sharing the story of how Patricia Williams first got into investigative work and why she's dedicated her life to exposing people like Rebecca. It's a story that will make you believe in the power of one person to change the world, one rescued family at a time. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for caring about families you've never met. And remember, if something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Your children's safety is worth more than anyone's feelings, including your own need to be polite or give people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like the help we've been praying for. But with awareness, support, and the courage to fight for what matters most, even the most carefully planned destruction can be overcome. We're living proof of that. We're going to be okay. We're more than okay. We're home.